Helen. Omond, Fayum. Panhart, Miss Ninette. Piers, Mrs. E. Pomeroy, Miss Ellen. Potter, Mrs. Thomas Jr. Puchin, Major Arthur. Peercalt, Miss A. Ryerson, John. Renago, Mrs. Mamam. Renelt, Miss Appy. Rothschild, Mrs. Lord Martin. Rosenbaum, Miss Edith. Rhymes, Mr. and Mrs. George. Rosibel, Miss H. Rhodes, Countess. Robert, Mrs. Edna. Rolmain, C. Ryerson, Elise Susan P. Ryerson, Miss Emily. Ryerson, Mrs. Arthur and maid. Stone, Mrs. George M. Skeller, Mrs. William. Segaser, Miss Emma. Seward, Fred K. Shutter, Miss. Sloper, William T. Swift, Mrs. J. Joel. Schaubert, Mrs. Paul. Shadell, Robert Douglas. Snyder, Mr. and Mrs. John. Serapica, Alice Augusta. Silvertier, R. Spencer. Sailfield, Adolf. Stahilin, Max. Seminois, Alphonsus. Smith, Mrs. Lucy and P. Stevenson, Mrs. Walter. Solomon, Abraham. Sylvie, Mrs. William B. Stenmel, Mr. and Mrs. Healy. Spencer, Mrs. W. A. and maid. Slater, Miss Hilda. Spedden, Mr. and Mrs. F. O. and child. Stephenson, H. B. Strauss, Mrs. maid of. Schaubert, Mrs. Emma. Splinter, Mrs. E. Simmons, A. Taylor, Miss. Tucker, Mrs. and maid. Thayer, Miss J.B. Thayer, J.B. Jr. Tossig, Miss Ruth. Tossig, Mrs. E. Thor, Miss Ella. Thorn, Mrs. G. Taylor, Mr. and Mrs. E. Z. Trout, Miss Jessie. Tucker, Gilbert. Woolner, Hugh. Ward, Miss Anna. Williams, Richard M. Jr. Warren, Mrs. P. Wilson, Miss Helen A. Williard, Miss C. Wick, Miss Mary. Wick, Geo. Widener, valet of. Widener, Mrs. George D. and maid. White, Mrs. J. Stewart. Young, Miss Marie. List of survivors, second cabin. A basin, Mrs. Mana. Abbott, Mrs. R. Argenia, Mrs. and 2 children. Angel, F. Angle, William. Balmthorpe, Mrs. L. Balls, Mrs. Ada E. Bus, Miss Kate. Becker, Mrs. A.O. and 3 children. Bean, Edward. Bean, Mrs. Ethel. Bryhe, Miss D. Beasley, Mr. L. Brown, Mr. T.W.S. Brown, Miss E. Brown, Mrs. Bentham, Lillian W. Bystrom, Carolina. Bright, Dagmar. Bright, Daisy. Clark, Mrs. Ada. Cameron, Miss C. Caldwell, Albert F. Caldwell, Mrs. Sylvan. Caldwell, Alden, infant. Christie, Mr. and Mrs. Collier, Mrs. Charlotte. Collier, Miss Marjorie. Christie, Miss Alice. Colette, Stither. Krista, Miss Disha. Charles, William. Frost, Millie Mall. Doley, Mrs. Elise. Drew, Mrs. Lulu. Davis, Mrs. Agnes. Davis, Miss Mary. Davis, John M. Dulon. Florentine. Duvan, Miss A. Davidson, Miss Mary. Doling, Miss Ada. Driscoll, Mrs. B. Dystrom, Caroline. Encarnacion, Mrs. Ronaldo. Fawnthorpe, Mrs. Lizzie. Formery, Miss Ellen. Garside, Ethel. Garachi, Mrs. Marcy. Genovese, Angier. Hart, Mrs. Esther. Hart, Eva. Harris, George. Hewlett, Mrs. Mary. Heber, Miss S. Hoffman, Lola. Hoffman, Lewis. Harper, Nina. Hold, Stephen. Hold, Mrs. Anna. Hawking, Mr. and Mrs. George. Hawking, Miss Nellie. Herman, Mrs. Jane, 2 daughters. Healy, Nora. Hanson, Jeannie. Hamathian, W. Hamathian, Anna. Harnlin, Anna and child. Elette, Bertha. Jackson, Mrs. Amy. Juliet, Levinch. Jerwan, Mary. Juhan, Holdrel. Jacobson, Mrs. Keen, Miss Nora H. Kelly, Mrs. F. Kentar, Mrs. A. Leitch, Jessie. LaRoche, Mrs. and Miss Simone. LaRoche, Miss Louise. Lehman, Bertha. Launch, Mrs. Alex. Lenore, Amelia. Lystrom, Mrs. C. Mellinger, Elizabeth. Mellinger, child. Marshall, Mrs. Kate. Mallette, A. Mallette, Mrs. and child. Mange, Paula. Mayor, Mrs. Florence. Meller, W.J. McDermott, Miss Layla. McGowan, Anna. Nye, Elizabeth. Nasser, Mrs. Delilah. Musa, Mrs. A. Oxenham, Percy J. Phillips, Alice. Palace, Emilio. Padro, Jitleon. Krinsky, Rosa. Portatilli, Emilio. Harsh, Mrs. L. Clet, B.